Yeah, I've got to say, I have never been happier to be a part of this movement. I don't even know what this movement is, to be honest. It's, this weird amalgamation of atheists, skeptics, secularists, whatever it is. It's an inspiring thing to be a part of. The theists like to argue that atheism is turning into a religion, or that it already has. Kind of weird that religious people would try to insult us by calling us them, but whatever. And I've also heard a few atheists echoing this same thing, more as a warning than an aspersion. And I guess I see what they're trying to say, even if I don't agree with it. You're right. They're saying that we're creating an insular, self-selected community, and by so doing, we're bound to create leaders and dogmatism, and we're going to otherize and factionalize and otherwise naturally evolve into the very thing that we're fighting against. But they are wrong. Because you're way too awesome for that, and I learned that in dramatic fashion this week. So let's start off with the word religion, right? What the fuck is a religion? If we're turning into a religion, let's define what that means. Now, obviously, you got your dictionary definitions and shit, sure, but when you listen to a couple of philosophers try to pin this down, it feels like you're playing Jeopardy in Wonderland. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to be super generous to the doomsayers who warn of atheism's inevitable religionization, and we're going to go with the most basic aspects so that we can use the widest possible definition. The one thing that all religions share in common is the sacred, right? Something's revered and unquestionable. Something's absolute. Something is sacred. That's something that all religions have, and basically no non-religions have. Now, I guess you could argue that certain political organizations and movements have a sacred, like a sacred text or whatever, but you could further argue that they start to morph into religions at that point. This is a discussion that takes us way too far afield. So let's just knock that off for the second and assume that they're right, that these atheism is going to be a religion. Two guys are right. And despite our best efforts to the contrary, all the trappings of religion just naturally grow up around us, okay? What would be the sacred? Now, let me leave that question hanging in your ears for a minute and tell you about my inbox this week. On last week's Diatribe, I made some controversial statements on mythicism and ruffled the feathers of a lot of listeners. And I knew that I would. I said as much during the Diatribe. And to be fair, several listeners raised what I thought were really valid objections to the wording that I used in that Diatribe, and a few of them raised valid objections to the actual points that I was making. And I'll address several of those in the feedback segment at the end of the show. But there were also some, we're going to say, not so valid objections offered up as well. And look, every group of people has bad arguers in it. I'm not saying this is something specific to mythicists. That's just the group that I pissed off last week. So I got to meet a lot of their bad arguers. And not to be overly derogatory, but a lot of the arguments they made were just a mad-libbing away from the arguments I get from creationists. Arguments like, well, here's an educated person with a relevant PhD that disagrees with you. Or, well, you just can't trust anything that comes out of that academic field. Or, I demand that you explain these three disparate facts that you couldn't possibly be qualified to explain. And I have to be honest, some of this shit was super depressing. I got multiple emails that started off by saying all of biblical scholarship must be ignored because they're all biased dogmatists whose objectivity can't be trusted, and then they went on to cite Robert Price or Richard Carrier to defend their position. I thought to myself, how can this not send up a red flag for you as a skeptic? How can you not see that you're asking me to ignore all the people in the field except for the ones that agree with you? Now, again, there were also some valid objections, so I'm not trying to paint everybody who emailed me with the same brush here, and I'm also not trying to imply that mythicists are uniquely able to make shitty arguments in defense of their position, and that's what's so fucking depressing to me, right? This is a self-selected group of critical thinkers, so why should any of us be relying on logically unsound arguments, right? Especially when we have motivated reasons to believe the thing that's being presented. I honestly started to have this crisis moment where I was starting to think that, maybe no amount of foreknowledge of motivated reasoning can truly insulate a person against it. And that amounts to an existential crisis when you're a skeptical movement, right? But then an interesting thing started to happen. Arguments started to get retracted, or better, or replaced. See, when I write back to a creationist and I say, yes, Dr. Jesus does have a PhD in biology and does believe that Jehovah made humans out of clay, but the majority consensus is X, the creationist just ignores that and moves on to argument number 2. And nobody did that. Not a single one of the scores of contentious emailers I incited last week did that. When I pointed out a fallacy in their argument, they retracted it or they corrected it. When they pointed to a fallacy in my argument, I did the same. And in some instances, minds were actually changed. And even when they weren't, meaningful dialogue ensued. Now, look, I know that I'm in a position to see the best of this, right? I mean, these are our listeners writing in, so they're naturally inclined to agree with me, or at least to, look at what I say in the most favorable possible light. I'm not exactly getting a random cross-section of people who disagree with me, and I have no illusions that skeptics are always logically sound in the YouTube comments or anything. Hey, I said no illusions. But the key here, though, is minds did change. Even after contentious arguments, everybody was at least willing to rethink their starting assumptions, and at all times in every conversation, the evidence was the arbiter. We didn't always agree on the answer, but we always agreed on the right way to get there. We always agree, well, if you could show me this evidence, or if I could show you that evidence, we would change our minds. And what's more, when minds were changed, they were excited about it. They were proud to be swayed by a good argument. I posted something about it on Facebook, and much to my chagrin, a whole thread popped up below it of people more or less bragging about the last time they changed their mind on a contentious topic. Trans rights, capital punishment, corporal punishment, affirmative action, the Oxford comma, gay marriage, double spacing after the period. People proud of their willingness to follow the evidence. People looking for an opportunity to challenge the dogma wherever they saw it creeping in. And that's why I'm not worried about the slippery slope arguments about atheism turning into a religion like it just got bit by a were-theist. Because ultimately, if you have to hold something sacred, let's make it that nothing is sacred.